What's up, my friends? My name is Jason Morris and I am back to talk to you about cinematic footage. Now, what makes footage quite cinematic? So I am going to give you 5 tips to make your footage looking more cinematic and dramatic. Now, if you've been to filming school, one of the first things you would have learned is 3-point lighting. You've generally got your key light, which lights up the subject. Then you've got your fill light, which can bring out a little bit more on the opposite side. And then you usually have your headlight or backlighting. So that generally separates the subject from the background. So these simple fundamentals you need to apply when you're out in the field doing some footage. Lighting is probably one of the most important parts when it comes to that feel, that dramatic feel. It all depends on what kind of footage you want to capture, but it is very important to get really good lighting. So Hollywood likes to get the kind of lighting that gets the Rembrandt effect. So there's a little bit of a triangular effect of highlights here on the face, and you've got a little bit of shadowing, and then obviously your key light coming from the opposite angle of the Rembrandt lighting. So that's one of popular effects that Hollywood likes to use, especially to make it a little bit more dramatic. It's also a very popular photography style to shoot that Rembrandt effect as well. So moving on to the second one would be your frame rate. Now, in Australia, our standards are about 25 frames per second, whereas most movies are actually shot in 24 frames per second. Now, when you are shooting with your DSLR, just watch out for your settings because you don't want to just set it to 30 frames per second and then put it into Premiere Pro at 24 frames per second because it will look a little bit different. I mean, you can still edit in 25 and 30 frames per second, that's perfectly fine. It all depends on your preference, but the cinematic effect, 24 frames per second is pretty much the standard. Now, to get that slow motion feel, you do want to shoot in 60 frames or 120 frames per second to get that slow motion. So that means when you set your camera at 60 frames per second, it is getting 60 frames in every second of the footage. So you're cramming in more data. So just watch out because you will be filling up your memory card with extra footage because 60 frames is more than double 24 frames per second. Just a general rule, set it to 24 frames per second if you're shooting normal cinematic footage. Now, one of the most important ones when it comes to cinematic footage is camera angles and movements. The camera angle can depict exactly how you want your audience to feel when watching this footage. It can come down to a low camera angle where you want to try and make the subject look more tall and powerful, or you can look down on the subject where you want to try and make the subject look a little bit more small and less powerful. Just be careful of the 180 rule. So if you have a conversation with one person talking to another, you do want to try and position them on the thirds of the camera. So just remember your rule of thirds when you're shooting the cinematic footage. So there can be different camera angles in terms of dollying. So you want to, you can dolly in and out, or you can also use tracks as well, where you can go side to side. So I've recently bought this nice sliding track by Neewer, and it's really good for creating nice movement in a specific scene. So you can see this footage here. This could be something you'll be going for, but watch this when you add a little bit of the movement in. You can see the difference there already. It just makes it look 100 times better, in my opinion. But it just depends on what type of mood you're going for in that particular scene. Anyway, another tip is shallow depth of field. So shooting with your camera wide open is gonna focus on the subject and blur out the background. So that's gonna create a little bit more focus towards the subject, and then just try and get rid of the background so you're not focusing on the background too much. Sometimes it's a little bit risky shooting with shallow depth of field because Focus racking can be very difficult at times to try and catch that focus, especially if the subject is moving closer or even walking into the frame. You want to try and focus perfectly on the eyes as much as possible, so it can be a little bit difficult with focus tracking at a shallow depth of field. Now, last but not least, color grading. Color grading is one of the most important factors when it comes to post-production. So the editing part is where you can really make a video or even a piece of photography image pop out and just create a completely different feel to what it's actually shot in the camera. Because some of the cameras, there are some settings where you shoot in S-Log, completely flatten out the image, and then you create a little bit more colors in post-production. So there you have it, guys. That is nice quick 5 tips on making your footage look cinematic. I could dive into each individual piece much more and talk for hours and hours, but it would bore you guys. They're just some quick 5 tips that you can apply straight away when you do your filming next time. Please like my video if you could, that would be absolutely amazing. Subscribe if you already haven't, and watch out for my next videos. I'll see you next time, guys. Peace.